If you've ever stood at the back of a travelling fairground, the waltzers spinning, the dodgems crashing, the whole showground humming under strings of coloured lights, you've heard one. If you rode a double-decker bus through Manchester or Liverpool in the 1960s, or crossed the Irish Sea on a fishing vessel that smelled of salt and oil, or sat in a Lagonda motorcar in the 1930s while the countryside rolled silently past, you heard one, you just never knew its name. If you rode a double-decker bus through Manchester or Liverpool in the 1960s, or crossed the Irish Sea on a fishing vessel that smelled of salt and oil, or sat in a Lagonda motorcar in the 1930s while the countryside rolled silently past, you heard one, you just never knew its name. That sound, low, unhurried, almost meditative, a deep four-beat chug that settled into a rhythm like a slow heartbeat, and then simply stayed there, steady, purposeful, entirely unimpressed with itself. Not aggressive, not strained, just absolute. Engineers called it mechanical perfection. The men who drove the lorries and buses it powered called it the most honest engine ever built. And at its peak, that single factory on Barton Hall Engine Works, a site of just over 30,000 square meters off the Bridgewater Canal, employed 2,800 people and produced around 3,500 engines every year. And at its peak, that single factory on Barton Hall Engine Works, a site of just over 30,000 square meters off the Bridgewater Canal, employed 2,800 people and produced around 3,500 engines every year. Gardner engines powered the buses of every major British city. They powered generators at RAF airfields during the Second World War. They powered fishing junks in Hong Kong, grain barges on the Murray River in Australia, canal boats across Europe, and locomotives on narrow-gauge railways in Africa. Grain barges on the Murray River in Australia, canal boats across Europe, and locomotives on narrow-gauge railways in Africa. By the middle of the 20th century, Gardner diesel engines were being exported to customers in more than 50 countries. The world export leader in commercial diesels, built in Manchester by one family, on one site. They survived competition from American diesel giants flooding the British market with cheaper, less refined alternatives. They adapted, they refined, they built the 6LW, and then, in 1958, they introduced the engine that would define the entire industry, the 6LX, the finest naturally aspirated diesel engine the world had ever produced. And then they threw it all away. Not through bad luck, not through forces beyond their control, through one man's absolute, unbreakable arrogance, through a refusal so complete, so stubborn, that it handed the company to outsiders, stripped its independence, destroyed its workforce, and ended one of the most remarkable engineering stories in British industrial history. How does the most admired engine manufacturer in Britain end up surrendering its independence in 1977 and ceasing production entirely by 1994? And what really happened inside those walls on Barton Hall? Between the family that built it and the family members who could see disaster coming and were silenced before they could act? Those are the questions. The answers are harder to hear than they ought to be. Chapter 1. A Cellar in Whom. Lawrence Gardner was the son of a miller, not a gentleman, not an educated man in any formal sense. He was born in 1843 in a Manchester that still smelled more of horse dung than coal smoke, though that was changing fast. He grew up at a time when the city was remapping itself daily, when the streets of Hume and Ancoats were being laid over fields that had been open countryside 20 years earlier, and when a man with a practical mind and a steady hand could find work anywhere in the industrial sprawl. He had both. What he also had, from an early age, was a refusal to do things the way other people did them. Not laziness, the opposite. Lawrence Gardner worked at a pace and precision that consistently embarrassed the journeymen around him. He had learned engineering in the way most men of his generation learned anything, by watching, by doing, by making mistakes that cost money and then refusing to repeat them. He had no formal apprenticeship in any institution. What he had was a workshop brain. In 1868, he decided to work for himself. He was 25 years old. The brass plate that went up on the wall of 4 terraced cottages in Upper Duke Street, Stretford Road, Hume, read simply, L. Gardner, Machinist. That was it. No flourishes, no claims, just a name and a description of what he did. He was, as his own records describe, offering himself as precisely what he was, a man who could make things from metal. The workshop was not in one of the cottages. It was below them, in the communal cellar shared by all 4 properties, accessed through a trapdoor in the pavement. To get his equipment down there, Lawrence Gardner ran ropes and pulleys from planks pushed out of a bedroom window above the trapdoor. A 10.5-inch lathe went down that way. So did an 8-foot boiler. Neither could fit through any door in the building. He lowered them one at a time on planks and hemp rope down through the pavement. He lived with his family in one of the 4 cottages. The other 3 he let to tenants. When those tenants fell behind with their payments and the landlord threatened to seize Lawrence's workshop tools in lieu of debt, he took out a building society loan and bought the properties outright. The weekly repayment was 31 shillings and 6pence. He made every single payment. This detail matters, because it tells you something essential about what Gardner was, and what the company would remain for the next 100 years. It was not a company built on capital. It was not a company built on investors or shareholders or borrowed confidence. It was built on the particular quality of one man's refusal to be beaten by circumstances that would have stopped most people before they began. The cellar, the planks, the building society loan. Lawrence Gardner's early products were various in the way that all small engineering workshops of that era were various. He made whatever paying work came in. Sewing machine components, mechanical parts for local textile manufacturers, small pieces of custom brasswork. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, as his sons, Joseph, Thomas, Hugh Sr., and eventually others, grew old enough to learn the trade alongside him, the workshop on Upper Duke Street became something more defined. It built a reputation for precision work, for components that fitted. In an age when tolerances were often approximate, Lawrence Gardner's parts were not approximate. They were exact. He died in 1890. He was 47 years old. He left behind a small but solvent engineering firm, a building society mortgage that was nearly paid off, and sons who had been trained not in any school, but on his workshop floor, to his exacting standard. His sons would take the name L. Gardner and Sons, and they would take the standard with them, far further than their father ever imagined. Chapter 2. Gas Engines, Diesel, and the Move to Patricroft. The firm that Lawrence's sons inherited was capable, but small. What the Gardner sons understood, and what gave them their next direction, was that the age of the stationary gas engine was arriving. In the 1890s, gas engines were transforming small industry across Britain. Mills, printworks, bakeries, machine shops, all of them had previously relied on steam power, which required a boiler, a stoker, a head of pressure, and constant attention. A gas engine needed none of that. You connected it to the mains supply, turned a valve, and it ran. Quietly, reliably, and cheaply enough to make sense for a business of almost any size. Gardner began building gas engines around 1895. They were good from the start. By 1899, the business had outgrown every inch of the Hume premises, and the sons made a decision that would set the company's geography for the next 95 years. They moved to Barton Hall Engine Works in Patricroft, just west of Eccles, beside the Bridgewater Canal. The site had space, it had water access, it had room to grow. In 1903, the company became L. Gardner and Sons Limited, a formal, limited company. Diesel engine production began that same year, almost before the word diesel had entered common use in Britain. Rudolf Diesel had patented his compression ignition engine in 1892. It was 1903. Gardner was already building them. The First World War transformed the Patricroft site overnight. The guns of 1914 needed ammunition, parts for field guns, and, crucially, engines for the tanks that the War Office was beginning to commission. Gardner made all three. The factory floor was reorganized. The workforce expanded. Women were employed on the production line for the first time, operating two machines in particular, a decision that prompted a formal protest from the male workforce, but which the management carried through regardless. This was 1914. The country needed what the factory could produce, and the Gardners intended to produce it. After the war, the company returned to its peacetime specialisms. Through the 1920s, the sons developed a series of increasingly refined diesel and semi-diesel engines for marine and industrial use. Gas engines, oil engines, hot bulb semi-diesels. Each one built to a standard that assumed the customer would run it hard, for years, with minimal attention. Then, in 1929, something happened that changed everything. A Lancia bus, one of the flat-nosed Italian designs that were beginning to appear on British roads, was fitted experimentally with a Gardner marine engine. The engine in question was the 4L2, a unit designed for boats and stationary use. It had no right to work well in a bus. It was too heavy, too slow revving. But it ran. And it ran with a smoothness and reliability that made the engineers who drove that bus look at each other and ask the same question. What if Gardner built an engine specifically for road vehicles? The man who answered that question was Hugh Gardner, not the original Hugh, Lawrence's son, but the next generation. Hugh Gardner II was the chief designer who would define the company for the next 4 decades. A man of formidable technical intelligence and, as would become clear in time, an equally formidable stubbornness. In 1931, he introduced the LW series, a modular direct-injection diesel designed specifically for road use. Separate cast-iron cylinder blocks and heads, available in 4, 5 and 6-cylinder configurations. The 6LW produced 102 horsepower at 1,700 revolutions per minute. By the standards of the time, it was a revelation. Bus operators across Britain began specifying Gardner engines. Lorry manufacturers followed. The 6LW set the template for what a British heavy vehicle diesel should be. Conservative in power ratings, built to tolerances that were exceptional for the era, designed to run for hundreds of thousands of miles between overhauls rather than merely tens of thousands. By the end of the 1930s, Barton Hall Engine Works employed 2,800 people on a site of over 30,000 square meters. 3,500 engines left Patricroft every year. The company had survived the Great Depression, not easily, but without catastrophic loss, and it was about to face its second war. Chapter 3: The Golden Age of the 6LX. Through the Second World War, Gardner produced diesel engines of their own design for the war effort. The 6LW went into service vehicles. The factory ran through the nights of the Manchester Blitz. The men and women of Patricroft built engines while the city around them was under attack. By 1944, the factory was running 3 main engine types simultaneously: the LW, the L2, and the 4LK, across round-the-clock shifts. After 1945, the LW continued in large-scale production, powering the rebuilding of British road transport. But Hugh Gardner, now firmly in control as chief designer, was already thinking about what came next. The LW was 8.5 litres. It was good. He knew it could be better. And through the early 1950s, he and his brother John worked toward a new design that would, when it finally appeared, be regarded by engineers around the world as simply the best naturally aspirated diesel engine ever produced. The Gardner 6LX appeared in 1958, 10.5 litres, 6 cylinders, cast-iron cylinder block, alloy crankcase, and a unique feature that set it apart from almost every other diesel engine on the market. The crankshaft main bearings were braced not only vertically in the conventional way, but horizontally as well. The bottom end of the engine was, as a consequence, phenomenally stiff. Warranty claims for terminal failure were virtually non-existent. In an industry where engine rebuilds at 200,000 miles were considered normal, Gardner engines in trucks and buses were routinely reaching 500,000, 600,000, even 800,000 miles before requiring major attention. There are recorded cases of 6LW engines accumulating over 1 million miles of commercial service. The 6LX produced 150 horsepower at 1,700 revolutions per minute. Its thermal efficiency, the proportion of fuel energy converted to useful work, exceeded 40%. That was a figure that the rest of the diesel world would not routinely match for another decade. Maximum torque arrived at 975 revolutions per minute, then held through to 1,100 revolutions per minute. This meant that the engine was working most efficiently well below the speed at which comparable engines from Cummins, Leyland, or AEC produced their best outputs. A Gardner engine, in practical terms, never needed to be hurried. A driver who understood this could manage a loaded eight-wheeler up a long gradient in top gear, using almost no fuel, at a road speed that kept the tachometer barely above idle. To build one 6LX, the men of Patricroft spent weeks. Components were matched individually, not produced to a batch tolerance and assembled at random, but sorted by dimension and paired so that the clearances in each engine were optimized by hand. Cylinder heads were ground by craftsmen who spent years developing the sensitivity in their fingertips to feel when a surface was truly flat. Fuel pumps were calibrated and recalibrated. Much of the injection equipment was made in-house. Gardner designed and manufactured components that most engine builders bought from outside suppliers because they did not trust outside suppliers to meet their standard. By 1961, the works employed 2,500 people. By the mid-1960s, Gardners powered the majority of new British buses, leaving the coach builders. Leyland, AEC, Bristol, they all offered Gardner-engined variants as the premium option. The 6LXB, introduced in the late 1960s, took output to 180 horsepower at 1,850 revolutions per minute, with a gross figure of 188 brake horsepower, though Gardner characteristically advertised the conservative installed figure rather than the headline number. Though Gardner characteristically advertised the conservative installed figure rather than the headline number. When rivals were talking up their power ratings, Gardner was quietly talking them down. The engineers knew the truth. A Gardner 180 was running at leisure. The showmen of Britain, the families who operated travelling fairs and fairgrounds from Lincolnshire to Ayrshire, became among Gardner's most devoted customers. A fairground runs on generators. A generator that breaks down on a Saturday night in a field in Shropshire means lost revenue and furious punters. They bought Gardners. Many of those engines, installed in fairground generators in the 1960s and 1970s, were still running when the century turned. In the Patricroft community, the works were everything. Fathers brought sons in as apprentices. Grandfathers had worked the same machines their grandsons would later operate. The streets around Barton Hall, Liverpool Road, Green Lane, Stanton Street, were populated by families who had worked at Gardner's for 2 or 3 generations. The company did not advertise heavily, did not market itself with the aggression of American industrial firms. It relied on its reputation, and its reputation, through the 1950s and into the 1970s, was so strong that it barely needed anything else. What almost nobody knew at the time, even within the trade, was that the thermal efficiency figure Hugh Gardner had achieved with the 6LXB was being reached partly by designing the engine to work within its capabilities rather than at their limit. Every other diesel manufacturer of the era was pushing their engines harder, specifying tighter clearances, running higher temperatures in pursuit of more horsepower per litre. Gardner was doing the opposite. By building an engine with generous tolerances and restricting its governed speed, Hugh Gardner was trading maximum power for maximum longevity. The 6LX series did not fail because it was never truly asked to try. That was the genius of it. And it was also, when the market changed, going to be its undoing. Chapter 4. The cracks beneath the paint. The first signs that something was wrong were not dramatic. They arrived quietly through the 1960s, as the commercial vehicle market began to change in ways that the Patricroft boardroom was slow to acknowledge. The change was this: horsepower had become a selling point. Not fuel economy, not longevity, not the cost of ownership over 1 million miles. Power. The European trucking market, led by Swedish and Dutch manufacturers who were beginning to sell heavily into Britain, wanted engines that could haul heavier loads at higher motorway speeds. Scania, Volvo, DAF were offering turbocharged diesels, producing 250 horsepower and beyond. The Cummins N series, the American unit that had been available in the UK since the 1950s, was reaching 250 horsepower with far superior torque than a naturally aspirated Gardner could match. The solution was obvious to anyone who looked at the competitive landscape without sentiment: turbocharging. A turbocharger forces more air into the engine's cylinders, allowing more fuel to be burned, and produces significantly more power from the same displacement. It was not new technology. Turbochargers had been used in marine and stationary diesels since the 1930s. By the 1960s, every serious diesel manufacturer in Europe and America was either already turbocharging or actively developing turbocharged variants. Hugh Gardner would not do it. The reasons he gave were technical. He argued that turbocharging placed stresses on an engine that shortened its life. He argued that customers who bought a Gardner bought longevity above all, and that a turbocharged Gardner would compromise the fundamental promise the name represented. He was not entirely wrong about the engineering. Turbocharged engines of that era did run hotter, did require more careful maintenance, and did sometimes fail earlier than well-maintained, naturally aspirated equivalents. But Hugh Gardner applied these observations with the force of absolute conviction and the authority of a man who owned the company and had no intention of being argued with. His nephew Paul Gardner knew differently. Paul Gardner was a younger engineer, trained at Patricroft and acutely aware of what was happening to the market. He had watched Gardner's truck customers, ERF, Atkinson, Foden, begin placing orders for Cummins and Rolls-Royce engines instead. He understood that once a customer changed engine supplier, the relationship was broken, possibly for good. And he had been quietly, in his own time, experimenting with a turbocharged version of the 6LX. And then, inevitably, Hugh found out. The ultimatum was delivered in terms that left no ambiguity. Paul Gardner would cease his experiments immediately, or Hugh Gardner would resign from the company he had led for decades. In a family firm where Hugh's authority was essentially absolute, there was no mechanism to override him. The experiments stopped. The turbocharged prototype was shelved, and the Gardner 6LX continued its production run, unchanged, into the 1970s, as the Cummins N series and the Rolls-Royce Eagle added horsepower year by year, and Gardner's share of the truck market contracted with every passing season. The bus market remained more loyal for longer. Bus operators valued the fuel economy and reliability that a Gardner provided, and the duty cycle of a city bus, stop, start, rarely exceeding 40 miles per hour, suited a low-revving, high-torque engine well. But even here the numbers were beginning to tell. The 6LXC, the last naturally aspirated variant Hugh Gardner personally approved, produced 195 horsepower. It had taken 35 years of development to get there. A Cummins L10 offered 250 horsepower off the shelf. In June 1976, Rolls-Royce Motor Holdings, then a separate entity from the aero-engine Rolls-Royce, acquired a 17% shareholding in L. Gardner and Sons. The move was a signal, if anyone in Patricroft was paying attention. Rolls-Royce was circling. And if Rolls-Royce didn't land the company, someone else would. The Gardners had produced a genuinely irreplaceable product and then, through a single designer's refusal to adapt it, had allowed the product's value to decline until the company itself became a target. By the late 1970s, even Hugh Gardner finally acknowledged that the ship was sinking. The family put the company up for sale. Chapter 5. The Outsiders Arrive. In August 1977, Hawker Siddeley Group acquired L. Gardner and Sons through a cash offer for the company's shares. The price has never been fully disclosed in public records. What is known is that Hawker Siddeley was, at that moment, undergoing its own transformation. The Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act of April 1977 had already nationalized the group's aviation and dynamics divisions into British Aerospace. What remained of Hawker Siddeley was a holding company with engineering interests spanning railway signalling, industrial electronics, and now, as of that August acquisition, diesel engine manufacturing in Manchester. For Hugh Gardner and his brother John, the sale was effectively the end. Both men retired from the board in the months that followed. They had built, or rather inherited and perfected, one of the finest engineering products in British industrial history, and they had, by their own choices, made themselves irrelevant to its future. Hugh Gardner died in September 1989. His obituary in Motorsport magazine noted simply that he had been chairman of L. Gardner and Sons until his retirement in 1978. It said nothing about turbochargers. What Hawker Siddeley found when they walked into Barton Hall Engine Works in the autumn of 1977 was a facility of exceptional craft quality and almost no capacity for change. The tooling was largely manual. The assembly processes depended on individual skill to a degree that no modern production engineering specification could adequately capture. The workforce, several hundred by this point, a fraction of the 2,800 who had been employed in the 1930s, were experienced, but they were experienced in doing things one way. Hugh Gardner's way. Paul Gardner, still with the company, now had his opportunity. Hawker Siddeley sanctioned a turbocharging program within months of taking control. Paul Gardner threw himself into it. The 6LXCT emerged from the development program rated at 230 horsepower. The 8LXCT, the 8-cylinder variant, reached 300 horsepower. These were respectable numbers. They were not, however, the numbers Gardner needed to retake the truck market it had surrendered across the previous decade. Cummins had not stood still. Neither had Volvo. The gap, in power terms, had been closing, but Gardner was still behind, and more importantly, it had lost the commercial relationships that mattered. ERF, the Sandbach lorry maker that had been one of Gardner's most loyal customers since the 1930s, had already moved substantially to Cummins Power. Atkinson was gone. Seddon Diesel, another Manchester firm, another piece of the same industrial ecosystem, had restructured. The hauliers who specified their lorries from these manufacturers were no longer asking for Gardner engines by default. That instinctive brand loyalty, built over 40 years of the 6LW and early 6LX era, had eroded. The bus market remained. Into the 1980s, the 6LX series was still the preferred engine for a significant portion of British bus production. Dennis Dominators and Dragons were available with Gardner power. The Volvo Olympian, the double-decker that dominated British bus fleets through the mid-1980s, offered Gardner as an option. MCW Metrobuses left the Birmingham coachworks with Gardner's under the floor. The faithful city bus operators, the passenger transport executives of the West Midlands, Greater Manchester and Merseyside, continued to specify them. But in 1986, Hawker Siddeley sold Gardner. The buyer was Perkins Engines of Peterborough, the diesel division of the American agricultural giant Verity Corporation. The price was not published. Perkins's stated rationale was that Gardner would complement their existing line of lighter diesels, giving the group a presence at the heavier end of the commercial vehicle market. Truck magazine, reporting the deal in June 1986, called it "Perkins Snaps Up Gardner." The headline was accurate. Gardner, the company that had once been uncatchable, had been snapped. The detail that never quite made the headlines, not loudly enough anyway, was this. At the moment Perkins acquired Gardner, the truck market share had already slumped to a level so low that Perkins immediately suspended automotive engine production at Patricroft. The factory that had produced 3,500 engines a year in the 1930s was now running at a fraction of that capacity. The shutdown lasted until October 1986. When production resumed, it resumed at a rate of approximately 250 new engines per year. Almost all of them went to bus operators. The truck market was, in practical terms, gone. Chapter 6. The Collapse in Detail. Perkins had not bought Gardner to save it. This became clearer with every passing quarter. The corporate logic was straightforward. Perkins wanted Gardner's bus market customers to switch to Perkins Eagle engines, the 12-litre unit produced at their Shrewsbury division. The Gardner 6LX was, from a Perkins boardroom perspective, a product with a declining future. The investment required to develop a new Gardner engine that could meet emerging European emission standards, Euro 1 regulations, which would come into force in 1992, was substantial. The market those regulations would affect was shrinking. The arithmetic did not work. What Perkins did invest in was the 6LYT, a new turbocharged engine introduced in 1986, the year of the acquisition. The 6LYT was supposed to be the future of Gardner, a modern, higher-powered unit that would carry the name forward into the 1990s. It produced 320 horsepower. It should have been competitive. It was not. The men who had worked at Patricroft for 20 and 30 years were blunt about it. The 6LYT was, in the words recorded by multiple contemporary observers and former employees, rushed. The development time that had made the 6LW and the 6LX what they were, the iterative refinement, the hand-matching of tolerances, the years of testing before a design reached a customer's lorry or bus, was not given to the 6LYT. Under Perkins' ownership, with a corporate timetable and a Peterborough boardroom watching the quarterly figures, the new engine was accelerated into production before it was truly ready. It gained a reputation for unreliability that would have been unthinkable against a Gardner badge 5 years earlier. By the time the 6LYT's problems became common knowledge among fleet engineers, the damage was compounding. Leyland Bus had entered a preferential purchasing agreement with Cummins. Dennis Vehicles, the Guildford-based bus manufacturer, followed suit. The Volvo Olympian's principal engine option shifted away from Gardner. Bus operators who had been Gardner customers for 30 years began specifying alternatives, not because they wanted to, but because the product they were being offered was no longer the product they had trusted. Engine production of the 6LX series, nearly 100,000 units built over 34 years, ceased in 1992. The last 6LX to leave Patricroft was not marked with any ceremony that anyone has been able to find recorded. It simply went. One engine. The last of the line. The workforce figures across this period tell their own story. In 1961, the company employed 2,500 people. By 1977, when Hawker Siddeley arrived, the number had already fallen significantly. Under Perkins, the workforce contracted further. By the early 1990s, the production floor at Barton Hall was running on a skeleton of its former self. Many of the men who left did not find equivalent work. The precision engineering skills developed over careers of 20 and 30 years on Gardner-specific processes had limited transferability in a regional labour market that was, through the early 1990s, already under severe pressure from the wider deindustrialisation of Greater Manchester. In 1992, Commercial Motor, the trade journal that had covered Gardner since before the First World War, ran a major analysis under the headline, Gardner, A Tale of Technology. It was the trade press's verdict on the firm. The magazine concluded that Gardner's mistake had been a failure to adapt to a changing market. That computer technology had become essential in diesel engine development, and that Gardner, still relying on traditional hand assembly skills, had been unable to invest in the R&D budget that survival required. That verdict was not wrong. But it did not quite name the moment when adaptation became impossible. The moment in the late 1960s when a single man's refusal to allow experiments on a prototype turbocharged engine had set the company on an irreversible course. Perkins announced in August 1992 that it intended to sell Gardner. Commercial Motor reported it as the lead story. The company that Perkins had bought as a complement to their engine range had, in 6 years, ceased to be a viable automotive engine manufacturer. The reconditioning operation, rebuilding used Gardner engines to current standards, was now the primary revenue-generating activity. Perkins did not see engine reconditioning as fitting their corporate strategy. They wanted to move on. Automotive engine production at Patricroft ended in 1994. Chapter 7. The Last Day. There was no announcement that the final production shift was the final production shift. The men who worked the last weeks of Gardner automotive engine production at Barton Hall Engine Works did not know day to day whether it was the last week or not. The news came in stages. The 6LX had ceased. The 6LYT was being wound down. Orders were not being renewed. Perkins sold off what remained of a much-shrunken Gardner to a Manchester-based company called Texas Group. The press coverage was minimal. Gardner's end did not make national headlines. There was no question in the House, no ministerial statement about the loss of a great British engineering tradition. In the broader public conversation of 1994, the closure of a diesel engine works in Eccles was not news. The men who walked out of Patricroft for the last time were, many of them, the sons and grandsons of men who had walked in for the first time 60 years earlier. Some had fathers who had worked the wartime shifts. Some remembered their grandfathers describing what it had been like to build the first LW series in the 1930s. The craft knowledge these men carried was not catalogued or archived in any systematic way. It lived in their hands and their eyes and the judgment they had developed over decades of doing work that could not be reduced to a written specification. When they left, it went with them. What the Texas Group retained was the name and the marine engine operation, which continued at reduced scale from within the old Barton Hall site. Paul Gardner himself ran a remanufacturing operation from premises within the old plant for some years after the main closure. Paul Gardner Engineering eventually ceased trading, leaving just a handful of specialist firms to serve what had become a predominantly marine customer base. The workers dispersed. Some took early retirement. Others found work in what remained of Greater Manchester's engineering sector, though by 1994 that sector was a fraction of its 1970s size. Many were over 50. Most never found work that matched what they had done at Patricroft in terms of skill level or pay. The precision engineering tradition that had sustained Patricroft and the surrounding streets for nearly a century did not transfer elsewhere. It ended. Chapter 8. The Silence and What Remains. You asked how the most admired engine manufacturer in Britain ended up surrendering its independence and ceasing production. The answer is not complicated, though it is difficult to hear. It ended because one man, Hugh Gardner, chief designer, chairman, and the dominant figure in the company's history, made a decision in the late 1960s that he was not willing to allow his engine to be turbocharged. Because he had built something that he regarded as perfect, and the idea of altering it was, to him, a form of diminishment. When his nephew, Paul Gardner, began experimenting with turbocharged development in secret, Hugh Gardner discovered it and issued an ultimatum: stop or I resign. The experiments stopped. The turbocharged prototype was shelved. And from that moment, the company's fate was effectively settled. With the slow mathematical certainty of a market that was moving in one direction, while Gardner was standing still. They had every reason to survive. They had the best engine in the world, built by craftsmen who had spent their careers learning a standard of precision that could not be easily replicated. They had a loyal customer base that genuinely did not want to leave. What they did not have was the institutional capacity to override one man's conviction that he was right. The irony that history records is this: the technology that Hugh Gardner refused to adopt was the technology that had made him possible in the first place. Gardner's entire reputation rested on efficiency. The engine that most perfectly embodies the principle of doing more with less destroyed itself by refusing the technology that would have let it do that better. Today, the site of Barton Hall Engine Works in Patricroft is the Barton Hall Industrial Estate, warehousing, light industrial units, a van hire company, a storage facility. The canal still runs past it. On a still day, you can hear the motorway that replaced the old road network this part of Manchester once depended on. The Gardner name is not entirely silent. Gardner Marine Diesels continues to overhaul, remanufacture, and install marine specification Gardner engines. Gardner Parts Limited supplies components for Gardner engines of all types. The Anson Engine Museum in Poynton, Cheshire, holds an extensive collection of Gardner engines. On open days, you can hear them. The responsibility for what happened at Patricroft does not rest entirely on one set of shoulders, however clear the central failure is. Hawker Siddeley bought a company without a plan to rescue it. Perkins bought Gardner to harvest its bus market customers. The British government had no industrial policy. But at the centre of it is one man in a boardroom in Patricroft in the late 1960s hearing a report about a prototype turbocharged engine his nephew had been developing in secret, and saying no. If you worked at Patricroft, or if your father did, or your grandfather, tell us what you remember. The record of what was built in that cellar in Hume and what it became belongs to the people who were there. And if this story means something to you, please consider subscribing. There are dozens more stories like this one, British industrial histories that never made the national papers. Every subscription helps us tell another one.